were threatened by some of the group's followers. That vote was 371 to 18, with one member voting present.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentlewoman from Washington is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, QAnon is a movement promoting a collection of unfounded conspiracy theories that have spread on the internet over the last several years. These conspiracy theories undermine public trust in our democratic institutions and our election process. And that is why I am pleased to support this important bipartisan resolution by Representatives Malinowski and Riggleman. QAnon initially alleged that prominent Americans are engaged in a secret plot to control the world, while using their power to exploit children. It now extends to a range of dangerous conspiracy theories. The FBI has assessed with high confidence that, quote, fringe political conspiracy theories, end quote, including QAnon, again a quote, very likely to motivate some domestic extremists, wholly or in part, to engage in criminal or violent activity, and that these conspiracy theories very likely encourage the targeting of specific people, places, and organizations, thereby increasing the likelihood of violence against these targets. Close quote. As the members may know, the resolution's lead sponsor, Representative Malinowski, has himself faced threats from QAnon supporters after he was falsely accused of lobbying to protect sexual predators. According to the Combating Terrorism Center at the West Point Military Academy, again a quote, QAnon is arguably no longer simply a fringe conspiracy theory, but an ideology that has demonstrated its capacity to radicalize to violence individuals at an alarming speed, end quote. Fortunately, a growing number of political leaders recognize the threat that QAnon poses, and that includes Republican House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy, who recently said that, quote, there is no place for QAnon in the Republican Party. The Malinowski-Riggleman resolution does several things. It condemns QAnon and rejects the conspiracy theories that it promotes. It encourages the FBI and all federal law enforcement agencies to continue to strengthen their focus on preventing violence, threats, harassment, and other criminal activity by extremists motivated by fringe political conspiracy theories. And finally, it urges all Americans, regardless of our beliefs or partisan affiliation, to seek information from authoritative sources and to engage in political debate from a common factual foundation. I would hope that these are principles we could all agree with on a bipartisan basis. I urge all members to support this resolution, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman from Washington reserves. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong support of this resolution, which condemns an extremist group known as QAnon. I have to admit that I'd only recently heard of this group, and I didn't know any of the details of their beliefs or tactics until this resolution was brought to us. But from what I've read, they are a delusional group that began with an internet post in 2017. They hold the bizarre belief that the federal government is infested with satanic pedophiles who are busy running a global child sex trafficking ring when they're not plotting against President Trump. Now, I'm tempted to say you can't make this stuff up, but obviously somebody did make this stuff up, and given the reach of the internet, it is apparently being taken seriously by some extremists who are turning to violence. Lest it get out of hand, it is appropriate for the House to speak with one voice on behalf of all of our communities across this great nation in condemning QAnon and its conspiracy theories. It should be clear to every man and woman of goodwill in this country that this group seeks only to further roil our society and divide our citizens along lines of race, religion, and politics. Even in this highly polarized political climate, I think we can all agree on this. But let me ask us all to do so without attempting to smear any party or candidate with the ravings from this, the lunatic fringe of our society. That term, lunatic fringe, was popularized by Theodore Roosevelt. He wrote this in his autobiography. He said, quote, "Then among the wise and high-minded people who in self-respecting and genuine fashion strive earnestly for peace, there are the foolish fanatics always to be found in such a movement and always discrediting it, the men who form the lunatic fringe in all reform movements." He continued, "As I've already said, there is a lunatic fringe to every reform movement." We have seen that borne out in the turbulent period of history that we now occupy, and how we deal with it will determine whether we can calm the political waters and restore peace and tranquility to our cities and civil discourse to our conversations. And in that regard, it's important to note that QAnon and the lunatic fringe on the right no more speak for the right than Antifa and the lunatic fringe on the left speak for the left. Both are poisonous to our democratic institutions, and both are destructive of what Lincoln called the mystic chords of memory that should unite us as a free people. So allow me to voice my hope that we will see similar condemnations of the lunatic fringe that has been given free rein in recent months to rampage, loot, vandalize, and burn so many of our towns and cities across America. QAnon and its allied groups are real, but Antifa and its allied groups are also real. Both are direct threats to our democracy because both threaten to employ violence for political ends, and that is the very definition of terrorism. No free society can long endure if their acts of violence are excused, ignored, or tolerated. Lincoln said it best: "There is no grievance that is a fit object for redress by mob law." To that I would add this observation: without law enforcement, there is no law, and without law, there is no civilization. I would express the fervent hope that before we adjourn, we will entertain condemnations of all groups and all sides that employ violence for political ends by name. Wednesday night, the Rules Committee rejected a motion on a party line vote that would have brought to the floor a resolution condemning Antifa and its allied groups concurrent with this resolution. That would demonstrate that this House speaks clearly and stands united against all such groups that have wrought such division and destruction in our communities. That's especially important when we survey the violence perpetrated by the lunatic fringe in Portland, Seattle, San Francisco, Oakland, Los Angeles, Chicago, New York City, Washington, D.C., Louisville, Kentucky, Minneapolis, and even Kenosha, Wisconsin. It is especially important when the mayors of these cities have withheld police protection from their own citizens, leaving innocent and peaceful shopkeepers and residents to the mercy of mob law, and when prosecutors have refused to hold accountable those who have perpetrated this violence upon the American people. There is precious little time before the election to take a stand clearly and unambiguously against all political violence, and with one voice to stand with the rule of law and not with the rule of the mob. If we could speak together on this most important issue, maybe we could start to find our way back to other fundamental principles and institutions that has always united us as a people and made our nation, in Lincoln's words, the last best hope of mankind on this earth. So please, my Democratic friends, do not squander this fleeting opportunity to turn back from the perilous road we're on and reclaim the precious legacy our forefathers left us. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from California reserves. Gentlewoman from Washington is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, it's now my honor to yield 5 minutes to the sponsor of this legislation, a leader in our caucus, Mr. Malinowski from New Jersey.
Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, it's one of the oldest lies in the world, a blood libel. And it always goes something like this, that there is a powerful secret group of people who just happen, many of them, to be Jewish, and they're trying to control the world and, for good measure, kidnapping our children. This is the central conspiracy theory that QAnon promotes today, and it sounds crazy, so crazy that sometimes we don't take it seriously enough. But throughout history, conspiracy theories, just like this one, have fueled prejudice, terrorism, even genocide. And today, social media is fanning the flames. Their algorithms know everything about us, what we search for online, our biases, and they feed us more and more extreme versions of what they think we want so that we stay glued to our screens and see more ads and buy more stuff. That, above all, is what is causing so many of our fellow Americans to fear and hate one another. And while many extremist groups on the left and the right are recruiting followers online, nothing today matches the scale of QAnon. Nothing comes close. On Facebook alone, QAnon pages and groups have had up to 3 million members. There have been days this year when the most widely shared social media messages in the country are those promoted by QAnon. The physical threat is also real. The FBI, as we've heard, says that political conspiracy theories like QAnon increasingly motivate domestic extremists to commit violence. The Combating Terrorism Center at West Point says that QAnon has demonstrated its capacity to radicalize to violence individuals at an alarming speed. And QAnon adherents have, in fact, committed numerous criminal and violent acts in the last 2 years. I think the greater threat is to our social fabric. QAnon is like a pill that immunizes you against objective reality, which millions of our fellow Americans are taking. It destroys trust in government, in democratic institutions, in science, and in facts. Mr. Speaker, the resolution we will pass today categorically condemns QAnon. It has an equal number of Republican and Democratic co-sponsors. I want to thank them. Representatives Riggleman, Kinzinger, Fitzpatrick, Gottheimer, and Luria. Our goal is a fully bipartisan repudiation of this incredibly dangerous phenomenon. Extremist movements gain validation from the belief that they are making inroads into the mainstream. So it's important to make clear we are unified against them, both parties. No hedging, no winks and nods. Now, there's just one more point I want to make today, and that is that when we vote for this resolution today, and I'm confident we will all vote for it, we need to mean it. And here's the only reference that I will make to partisan differences. It is an objective fact that this particular group of extremists today identifies with the right. There are a lot of them. And right now, even as we vote to condemn QAnon, there are political operatives out there putting out vile attacks that deliberately play to the paranoid fears QAnon promotes. Some people may rationalize this by pretending, oh, QAnon, it's not that bad. These folks are just against sex trafficking, which is a real threat, or that they're just against the deep state, and hey, so is President Trump. Some might say there are crazy groups on the left too, and that is absolutely true. And this resolution condemns them all. But you know what? When I criticize Antifa, as I have, I don't get half a dozen death threats in a day. Only one of these things, for now at least, is considered an active terrorist threat by the FBI. Only one is a political force. Only one is winning elections. Remember what QAnon is. It is an anti-Semitic, conspiracy-mongering cult that the FBI considers a potential terrorist threat, and it has real, growing political power. So, if you vote against fire today, please don't play with fire tomorrow. Don't be righteous here today and then go QAnon light on the campaign trail. Don't do or say anything to fan the flames further. Mr. Speaker, America desperately needs to come together. Conspiracy theories are tearing us apart. Let us pass this resolution and do it overwhelmingly and with true conviction so that we can say clearly we have all had enough. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Washington reserves. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield such time as he may consume to the co-sponsor of this resolution, the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Riggleman.
Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Before I begin today, I do want to extend my best wishes to President Trump and Melania. Our thoughts and prayers are with him as they battle COVID-19. I also want to thank Tom Malinowski for the amazing discussions that we have had going forward on this resolution, the amazing person to work with, and I thank you for your work, Mr. Malinowski, and everybody else. I do rise today at a pivotal moment in our nation's history and a moment of reckoning for our national discourse. The vitriol and anger spewing from both sides of the political aisle, echoing across the darkest corners and caverns of the internet, has led to violence and hate, divisiveness and anger. It has all but extinguished the light of reasonable political discourse in this great country called by so many a city on the hill. But we cannot continue to be this beacon of hope if we have been for so long, if we can't address the issues holding us back, the webs that have ensnared us, and the mistrust that has invaded our politics. The resolution before us today is not a panacea, but it asks us a question about our purpose here in this august body. Will we stand up and condemn a dangerous, dehumanizing, and convoluted conspiracy theory that the FBI has assessed with high confidence is very likely to motivate some domestic extremist, wholly or in part, to engage in criminal or violent activity? When my friend and colleague, Representative Malinowski, and I introduced a resolution condemning the QAnon conspiracy theory, we knew that we could draw the ire of those that believe in fantastical theories. We were condemning something that is a danger to our political discourse. QAnon believers have accused me of running a pedophilia ring for Israel, being a member of the Zionist organizational government, been called a traitor, accompanied by a picture of the gallows, and stated I was part of a target list. The grotesque nature of the tweets and Instagram posts and the anti-Semitic tripe spewed by QAnon adherents should cause concern for everyone. Obviously, this is all ridiculous, much like their theory. But the death threats Tom Malinowski received were a surprise and a shock. This type of behavior is easily condemned by all of us here in this chamber today. Putting aside the bizarre views of QAnon adherents, I call on this body to condemn them because of their actions that include threatening the life of my friend, Tom Malinowski, plotting to plant a bomb in the Illinois Capitol Rotunda to make Americans aware of the Pizzagate conspiracy theory, the murder of a man in New York in '29, and other such activities. QAnon and the conspiracy theories it promotes are a danger and a threat that has no place in our country's politics. I condemn this movement and urge all of my fellow members to join me in taking this step to exclude them and other extreme conspiracy theories from the national discourse. We talk about the First Amendment all the time. It is absolutely appropriate for the members of this body to use the First Amendment to call out those that are using their First Amendment gift, that First Amendment gift to the United States citizens, to attack other individuals. This nation has passed through stronger storms than this, and definitely in the past, and we will come out stronger still. But it takes leadership from the top to stand up against extreme ideas like QAnon. I call on this House to do that today. Support this resolution, pass it. I agree with my friend and colleague, Tom Malinowski, that we should not be playing with fire. I've been in the intelligence business. I know the power of information operations and false information. Again, let's pass this resolution. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Gentleman from California Reserve. Gentlewoman from Washington is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Cicilline.
The gentleman from Rhode Island is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the gentlelady for yielding. Mr. Speaker, one of the stages of deprogramming cult members is to point out the differences between the cult's ideology and reality. And QAnon is a cult. In an effort to reach some of the people who have fallen under its control, I'd like to point out a few facts. Mass shootings are not staged so that the government can come and take away your guns. John F. Kennedy Jr. died more than 20 years ago in a tragic aircraft accident. He is not in hiding, nor is he going to be President Trump's running mate. And President Trump is not fighting a secret war against a satanic child molesting network of politicians. It's a sad statement that discussing such obvious absurdities is occurring in this chamber today. But the fact is that some have praised QAnon and encouraged the growth of this cult, even as the FBI has labeled it a domestic terror threat. And sadly, with the support of the White House and even some members of Congress, QAnon has moved from the darkest corners of the internet into the mainstream of today's political discourse. This November, there will be 22 QAnon or individuals on the ballot for the House and the Senate who have either been endorsed by or lent credence to QAnon. This is a threat to public safety and to our democracy as a whole. This movement needs to be condemned, and its followers need to be brought back to reality, just as we would do with any other cult. And so I want to thank my colleague, Congressman Malinowski, for his leadership on this resolution, for the hard work he did to make certain that the condemnation of this dangerous cult is bipartisan. And I hope all of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle will support this resolution so we can send a message clearly and strongly to the American people that this cult is dangerous for our public discourse, dangerous for our democracy, and dangerous for our communities. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Gentlewoman from Washington reserves. Gentleman from California is recognized.
I reserve, and I have no further speakers, and so I'm ready to close when
Gentleman reserves. Gentlewoman from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think we have just a couple more speakers. I yield now 3 minutes to my good colleague and friend from Illinois, Representative Schakowsky.
Gentlewoman from Illinois is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in strong support of House Resolution 1154 and call on all of my colleagues to denounce the dangerous QAnon conspiracy theories. You know, QAnon is a new front on an old war and relies on anti-Semitic tropes in order to spread the message. QAnon followers actually believe that the world is controlled by a secret cabal of child abusers who will drink the blood of their victims. The FBI has linked the group to domestic terror and considers it a continuing terrorist threat. I want to thank Tom Malinowski for leading this and now for the kind of messages that he is getting, very, very frightening. And I also want to thank Denver Riggleman, and all of the bipartisan sponsors of this legislation. Just last week, my subcommittee held a hearing on how social media mainstreams extremism. When we heard from our witnesses, it was really terrifying. QAnon and other extreme groups have thrived for years on the internet, recruiting members, promoting racism, dividing our communities, and plotting actions of violence. And as people have suffered, big tech has prospered and profited. Algorithms that amplify profits for platforms like Facebook and YouTube, Twitter, also amplify extremism. This week, Facebook announced a ban on ads that support QAnon. Good, but it's far too little and far too late. Facebook users who are in QAnon-associated groups will still be able to see extremist content just further down the road on their news feeds. Moreover, Facebook groups promoting anti-Semitism have grown by 27% in the past week. Congress needs to denounce right now this kind of hate rhetoric, and big tech must be held accountable for profiting on this hate. Before I close, I would like to also state my support for House Resolution 1153 and thank Pramila Jayapal for leading the effort, and to Speaker Pelosi and Majority Leader Hoyer for their help on this resolution as well. Thank you.
Gentleman from Illinois yields back. Gentlewoman from Washington is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 2 minutes to my distinguished colleague from Minnesota, Mr. Phillips.
Gentleman from Minnesota is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the gentlelady for yielding. I rise today to urge a yes vote, a unanimous yes vote, on Mr. Malinowski's resolution. And quite frankly, I cannot believe that I have to stand on the floor of the United States House of Representatives to issue these remarks. Every one of us here swore the very same oath to defend our nation from enemies, both foreign and domestic. And QAnon is a dangerous enemy lurking right within our borders that must be forcefully and again, unanimously condemned. What they propagate is not real. Their baseless conspiracy theories, lies, and fear-mongering are creating something, however, that is very real. And that is division, it is hate, and if left unaddressed, violence against fellow Americans. Just this week alone, my dear friend, Representative Malinowski, has received numerous death threats for simply condemning QAnon. And Representative Spanberger, a former CIA officer, has been labeled a terrorist. And how could we forget Representatives Scalise and Giffords, both being shot within the last number of years by deranged people? Every one of you here knows the very lives of our colleagues are now at risk. So who's going to speak against it? Has hate really become a partisan issue? Is reality really up for debate? I applaud my friend, my dear friend, Representative Riggleman, who has spoken very forcefully and immediately against QAnon, and I know others are following suit. But for those who don't, for those who do not, what reason could you possibly have to remain silent? My friends, we are all Americans, every single one of us. And Americans are looking to us right now to model principled, thoughtful, decent leadership at this increasingly fragile time in our history, and history shall be our judge. I yield the remainder of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Gentlewoman from Washington is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Moulton.
Gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In response to September 11th, President Bush and this Congress sent soldiers and Marines like myself across the ocean to fight against extremism. The terrorists that we fought against used violence to advance their political agendas and viewed lawmakers here as their enemies. QAnon, the Proud Boys, the Boogaloo Boys, and other extremist groups think and operate in similar ways. But in this case, we do not have the luxury, Americans do not have the luxury of looking across the ocean at this threat and just hoping and praying that it doesn't come home. Members of these groups are American. Politicians have unforgivably embraced them. Social media platforms legitimize them to an unwitting public. Well, I've had enough. QAnon followers like to say in their vague, ominous ramblings that no one can stop what is coming. That's wrong. We can. And we will. Do not let the unforgivable mainstream support for these groups raise doubts about our nation's resolve in this fight against extremism, that we will stop what is coming, and then we will build a safer, stronger America. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Gentleman's time has yielded back his time. Gentlewoman from Washington is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 3 minutes to the distinguished gentlewoman from Texas and a member of the Judiciary Committee, Ms. Jackson Lee.
The gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, is recognized for 3 minutes.
Hope my time has not run. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And thank you to the gentlelady that's managing this resolution. Thank you very much, Mr. Malinowski, for bringing us together. I think I started out earlier this morning by saying the nation is better than this. It is not because people do not have the right to espouse views that I may disagree with. But when those views become detrimental to innocent Americans, when those views take the very hostile and historically violent form of anti-Semitism, when they begin to attack and marginalize groups, when they evidence themselves, as we saw, although not claiming to be part of QAnon, that scene in Charlottesville with tiki torches saying that part of the nation did not belong here, in essence threatening people of color, Jewish people. I believe this resolution is crucial. It is crucial because it is dangerous to remain silent. And as we have looked at QAnon, it is attempting to speak of fringe beliefs that can be enormously dangerous. It can actually motivate domestic extremists, which may result in harm to innocent persons. The FBI has made an assessment with high confidence that the fringe political conspiracy theories, including QAnon, are motivating domestic extremists. And where QAnon adherents have been implicated in one particular case of a man arrested in 2018 for plotting to plant a bomb in the Illinois Capitol Rotunda to make Americans aware of Pizzagate. And I think we're also aware of, during the last election, presidential election, someone driving and rushing to a restaurant in Washington, D.C. and going in the basement, suggesting that pedophiles and the then presidential candidate was involved in it. These are dangerous positions. They're not just that I disagree because the philosophy is different from Sheila Jackson Lee. It is that we must not be silent, for there have been atrocities perpetrated around the world historically because people remained silent. And the atrocities in Germany come to mind. We remained silent. Or the genocide in Sudan, we remained silent. And so this resolution is crucial. It is as crucial as the work we will do in addressing the sin, the original sin of this nation, and that was slavery. But I rise today to support H.R. 1154 that condemns QAnon and rejects conspiracy theories. I ask my colleagues to support this, and I thank the author of this legislation for his courage and leadership. I yield back.
Time has expired. Gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm prepared to close.
Gentlewoman reserves. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll close as I began. Extremist groups on the right and the left that advocate violence as a method of achieving political goals threaten the very foundations of our democracy, and I fully support this resolution and its denunciation of one such group called QAnon. But the American people can see with their own eyes where the violence on our streets is coming from, and I deeply regret that the majority is not willing to call out by name such groups as Antifa or to acknowledge that such evil forces even exist. We must speak out together against all such groups, and I'm deeply troubled that for some reason we cannot. We need to know who's funding these groups. We can already see with our own eyes who's encouraging them. We can see with our own eyes whose mayors have deliberately withheld police protection from their citizens as these extremist-driven mobs run rampant in our communities. We can see with our own eyes those politicians calling for defunding police departments that are the only means of defense that our citizens have. We can see with our own eyes those prosecutors who have refused to hold accountable those who perpetrate violence in our communities and who instead prosecute citizens who are desperately trying to defend themselves. So I'm pleased to support this resolution, but it is no substitute for a clear and unambiguous stand against all political extremism and violence that this House, for some reason, refuses to take. I yield back.
Yields back. Gentlewoman from Washington is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, before I offer closing remarks, I did want to ask for unanimous consent to introduce into the record for H.Res. 1153 a set of letters, translations of letters from the Irwin County Detention Center and the original letters, copies.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, in closing, let me start by thanking Mr. Malinowski and Mr. Riggleman for this bipartisan resolution, such an important statement. And I do hope all of my colleagues in this chamber vote for the resolution. I am troubled that some might try to take this bipartisan resolution and introduce other aspects that include calling out cities like mine, the city of Seattle, in other baseless comments. But the most important thing is to return to the context of this resolution. And the context is that it is sad that in the year 2020, a baseless anti-Semitic conspiracy theory has infected the political discourse of our great democracy. This body should not be giving such an unhinged internet hoax the time of day. Frankly, it is sad that in the past few weeks, the House has had to pass several resolutions, including a resolution calling for a peaceful transfer of power after this year's presidential election, to publicly reinforce democratic customs and norms that until recently were beyond question. But circumstances yet again require this body to make a statement. Through social media, this internet hoax has become so widespread that it has inspired threats and even acts of violence across the country, including against our members on both sides of the aisle. Unfortunately, rather than condemn this hoax, rhetoric that comes from the White House has instead given comfort to QAnon followers and credence to their belief in fabricated and fantastical theories. So under these circumstances, it is so good to be doing a bipartisan resolution in this House. It is imperative that the House of Representatives make it clear to the American people that QAnon is a hoax and that we absolutely and completely condemn the violence perpetrated by its adherents. I urge my colleagues to vote yes, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Who will control Congress in January? Stay informed on all the competitive